There are a lot of ways I could talk about transformation, the transformation, or the series of transformations that occur during the unbinding process or the awakening process, which includes the unfolding of the initial awakening insight into deeper insights. There's a lot of ways you can sort of break that down or make it into certain insights and steps and all that. And it's helpful, can be helpful. At the same time, for any given person, it doesn't usually feel like a series of stages, one after the other. Where it's often just a lot of nonlinear confusion, strange things going on, insights here and there, shifts here and there, a lot of shadow work. So your own process, as I always say, your own process is going to look probably different than anybody else's, really. There are going to be similarities, but don't depend on anyone else's map or description. Rather, just go to your own experience. Go directly to your own experience, and that's where the answer is. I don't know what the percentage is. A good percentage of questions I get, my answer is something like, don't worry about that, just go to your experience right now. What's actually happening right now? What are you feeling? What's the experience? One way or another, I'm almost always doing that, I suppose. But one way of breaking down this process into manageable bite-sized chunks would be to say that the initial insight, the initial glimpse, is into the sort of infinite nature of consciousness. There's a pretty interesting, simple, poetic series of Zen poems called Tozan's 5 Ranks, which sounds so like military, but it's Zen, you know. And the way he breaks it down, the very first one is realizing the relative within the absolute. And what that means is the relative is just life as you know it. It's before any kind of shift or insight, it's usually a life of quiet desperation. It's the world of mind identification or thought identification, the world of struggle, the world of trying to define and redefine oneself, the world of always defending, whether you know it or not, trying to defend the illusory structure of the self and the life and who you think you are, what you think you need. And it's very cognitive, again, whether you realize it or not. And the shift from that into this direct recognition of the infinite nature of consciousness. That's that first rank. To realize that with the relative, you don't even know the relative is the relative because you have nothing to compare it to. So you're in a sense cast out of the Garden of Eden. You don't even know the absolute. When you touch into that infinite nature of consciousness, then not only do you know the absolute, you realize the relative is simply a movement within the absolute. That your life as you've known it has been just one wave on the cosmic ocean. And again, this is not a conceptual thing, this shift, at all. It's noticeably not conceptual. It's felt at the identity level. It has to be, or it's not the shift I'm talking about. There's other shifts you can have, sure. So I could break this thing down into a very simple binary sort of process. There's that shift, that insight into the infinite nature of consciousness, the oceanic nature of being. And then there's an exploration of the direct experience of reality unreflected or undisturbed by consciousness, by the potentially distorting effect of identifying with consciousness. Now, I want to be clear, this doesn't mean you get rid of consciousness or become unconscious or something. That's not what it is. It's essentially moving from identity as infinity, identity as everything, identity as unbound consciousness or pure being or I am. So it's moving from that to, again, direct knowledge. I'll use the term knowledge loosely. It's not the normal connotation of knowledge, but you move to direct knowledge of that which is beyond identity, that which is beyond the filtering effect of identity, that which is beyond the distorting effect of identity. That's the second part. So I could really say that's pretty accurate, that both of those insights are very important. They're both becoming more and more common, I think, which is good because we have access to good pointing now, more than in the past. There was good pointing, the Pali Canon, the Bahya Sutta, there's all kinds of ancient texts, Mahayana texts that were interpretations of the original Pali Canon in Buddhism, the Upanishads. There are good pointers, but they're a bit encoded by 2,500 years of time, encoded by being translated from one language to another, encoded by traditions that are essentially gone or have changed significantly in the last couple, or the last millennia, let's say. So yeah, they're encoded, and so it can be tricky to pick through and find out what was actually said there in some cases. In some cases, it's pretty straightforward. The really clear, straightforward pointing I see that's ancient, that points directly to non-duality, is the Bahya Sutta, and actually the Thomas Gospel from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Gospel of Thomas, not included in the canonized Bible, but I've heard some scholars say it's as accurate as the three synoptic Gospels, but it's very different. It's very, very direct, like line after line. It seems that these, and the Thomas Gospel is also different in that the other Gospels mix like story and history and all this stuff, and then with the sort of words of Christ. The Thomas Gospel is just statements of Christ all the way through, and they're very direct. Many of them are very, very direct, non-dual pointing. It's really cool. So those are the two that come to mind as far as what points really clearly and directly to the non-dual. I'm not as familiar with the Upanishads, but there are a few Upanishads that also do that, I know. So it's there, but again, it's in funny language, it's in strange storytelling, ways that we don't necessarily look for that kind of pointing in with the contemporary mind or whatever. But now we have YouTube. Yeah, and it works. So more and more people are waking up. And the initial awakening is in some sense, it's a leap of faith. It's kind of what it feels like. There's sort of work up to that point, but the work up to that point is just really seeing how bad of a life manager you are. That's the work. You don't have to do a ton of emotion work, although it helps for sure. You don't have to have any other specific insights. You just have to really see that you can't make yourself truly satisfied. That's it. The first noble truth of Buddhism, life is suffering, life is dukkha, and I understand it's probably most clearly translated not as suffering, but as unsatisfactory. It's unsatisfactory. So when we first acknowledge that we feel unsatisfactory in life, which many people don't. I don't even know if they know they feel unsatisfactory. There's that many layers of distortion in our thought process. But once you see like, yeah, there's an unsatisfactoriness, then the next thing, of course, is you try to fix that with all the stuff, right? Love and creating other humans and having political causes and making yourself beautiful and making yourself strong and making yourself rich. And then, that's what usually happens next. And then you realize, hopefully you realize that none of that stuff works. It really does not address the deep unsatisfactoriness that you feel. And that can be scary to admit. And you could say it's scary to admit on the surface because what you're seeing is that there's no path out there that you know of so far that actually can deliver the goods. But it's also, I think, even more truly scary because something in you has known the whole time where you're going to have to go to address your unsatisfactoriness, and it's into something that's really unknown. And so that's really the deeper fear there, to admit to yourself, I am not a good manager of my life. Paul Hederman says it all the time, I'm not management material. But what that means is I realize now I can make all these different things happen, but none of them really deliver the goods. None of them make me feel settled, equanimous, at peace, okay, like deeply okay. None of that stuff does that, right? And once you see it, it's like, oh shit. And I've heard people say that many times. When you see it, it's like, oh shit, that's where I have to go. But it's kind of miraculous that they know where they have to go. They can feel that that's where they have to go. And then there's like, that's why it's an oh shit moment. But it's good that it's an oh shit moment, because if you didn't know the oh shit about it, that it would mean you don't know where to go, or you don't have that access. But you do have that access, and so you feel the gravity of it. You feel the gravity of just entering the unknown, entering deeply and fully into the mystery. And then that, again, often shortly after that, there'll be that shift. And then you're often just sort of surprised by the fluidity that comes beyond that, the fluidity of identity, the fluidity of consciousness, the sort of unreality of thought, how unbinding thought really is, or how non-binding thought really is. By the nature of thought itself. It doesn't mean that you won't be bound by thought. You will continue to be bound by thought for a while. But it's different. It's not really solid. It's not really real. But some thoughts are much harder to unbind from. The ones that are emotionally charged, or say connected to emotion that you're not fully in touch with. Those are the thoughts that are much more sticky and take longer to unwind. So that's when the next step, the next stage I'm talking about, it comes into play. Is it can be evasive. It doesn't seem like the trajectory of like moving through First Awakening and how that felt and all that. It doesn't really seem like where you need to go next is into direct experience, specifically into the senses, in the body sense. It somehow doesn't quite seem like that's where you need to go. It's a little too uninteresting for the mind, I think. But it is where you go. It's where you have to go, one way or another. Again, some people just have this knack for surrender. They have a knack to just let go into experience. And that's great. You don't need pointers for the most part. You don't need fetter inquiries or whatever. You just know where to go. Maybe it's a very feminine approach, let's say, energetically. But that's great. And there's a patience with it. There's a knowing that it's going to play out how it's going to play out. And I really can't. If I try to control it, I'm just going to end up in my head. And so that's a really nice way to approach this after the initial awakening. Moving through shadow work, assuming there's not a lot of active avoidance. There will be some. But when we get into deeper territory, when we're looking into the nature of the dualistic constructs themselves, what seem to divide the world up, seem to divide ourself up, seem to divide the senses up. When we get into that territory, it really can help. Nuanced pointing and nuanced investigation can be really helpful. More precise contemplations. And they really have to come from a place of spontaneity at this point. So I tell people, as they're sort of moving into deeper realization, that I can't tell you when it'll happen, but you should be open to the inevitable eventuality that the sense of the one on the path and the sense of the one living your life actually will kind of just sort of start dissolving into this sort of spontaneity. And that takes great faith in, call it the Dharma, the universe, because we're so afraid that, well, what if I let go of the path and then I just go back into what I used to be? I go back into delusion. But the nice thing is, after that shift, you're probably not going to. If you're even taking the time to listen to this kind of thing, you're not going to do that. There are people who do, though. There are people who will have probably an awakening or really a clear insight, and they do everything they can to control. And that turns it can be weird in a lot of ways. Can lead to addiction sometimes. Can lead to being a cult leader. Such a big term, cult leader, but there's actually a bunch of cults out there. Small and big ones still all over the place. Short of just having an obsession with control and a deep, 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 deep fear of not having validation, most people after awakening have the instinct that, okay, I'm not a freaking spiritual teacher. I'm a mess, actually. And I've been a mess. And now at least I can see the mess. That was a really good quote from Eric in the documentary. He's talking about awakening, and he's like, what it was just this huge pile of my life, all this stuff I've been trying to do, just this huge mess. He's like, but at least I could see the mess. I could see it. And it's manageable when you can see it. So that's a mature way to kind of move through first awakening. And after the honeymoon period, when the honeymoon period's fun, and then the end of the honeymoon period's when the fun really starts. It's not so much. It's uncomfortable. But to realize, okay, yeah, there's a pile of delusion and confusion and disorientations and bad coping mechanisms and good coping mechanisms and avoidance patterns and fear and shame and resistance and reactivity. It's just this big pile of stuff, right? In a sense. I mean, and what that really feels like is day by day, it's just more and more stuff is coming. Oh my God, when's this going to end? It's more fear. I'm feeling fear more closely than I ever could before. I never even knew what fear was. Shame. Oh my God, this core of shame is so daunting. And oh my God, I believe that. You're coming up with these beliefs and you're like, I've believed that all these years. How could I believe that? And what was it doing to me? Well, I'm glad I see it now, but holy shit, right? That kind of stuff. It just goes on and on and on for a few years, really, in one way or another. But again, a mature approach is to be just honest and that's what's happening. I'm here to address this stuff. That's what I came for. It's really it's the most important part in a way, because you can get an awakening for free. Some people do. Just happens. Which isn't always what you want either, because that can be really destabilizing if you don't know what it is. But the real quote unquote work is not these precise non-dual contemplations. Those are kind of fun. The real work is shadow work. The real work is reactivity work. The real work is resistance. The real work is seeing the hidden delusions and beliefs. The real work is finding boundaries that align not only with you, but with the bigger picture and with the energetics of life and what's going on, and the work of trust, learning to trust, the unbinding that's just going to go on and on and on and on, and realizing that it's actually spontaneous. It really is a spontaneous process, and approaching it from the place of spontaneity that does not preclude practices and inquiries. They will appear spontaneously as well. This is an important point because a lot of people really get this backwards. Because there's no self and because there's no agent, I'm not going to do anything. There's no point in inquiring. That's a misunderstanding. So then it comes down to a very, very simple thing. And someone asked Kevin Shanelek, who I interviewed about the Federer system, he kind of elucidated. Someone asked him in an interview before I interviewed him. I saw a series of interviews he had. It's hard to find. It's kind of obscure. But they asked, how many people that you've worked through the fetters with has it worked? Has it broken all of them? And I don't know what he said. I feel like he said something like he'd gone through it with 40 or 50 people. And I think he said 8 or 10 went through all of them. Which I don't want that to be discouraging. It doesn't mean only 1 out of 5 people can. It just means the way he approached it with them, that was the success rate. And a lot of times you might work on it, it doesn't really work, and then a couple of years later you come back and it does work. So it's just how this goes. It also could mean that those people would have benefited from a different approach or something. So no one approach is a one-size-fits-all in this. And that's why I really try to encourage different teachers and you to try different things and try different modalities. But always keep your eye on the ball when it comes to the fact that insight is critical. Without the insight, this is all just talk. But anyway, so yeah, he said, so, 8 or 10, I think is what he said, out of 40 or 50, if I remember right. And then this is the point I wanted to make is his interviewer said, what do you think the difference was? What was the difference between the people who got it or could move through the fetters and those who couldn't? And he said simply, it's their ability to understand what direct experience is. And I would say I agree with that. I agree with it, not that I think that's going to make or break you, and if you don't get it now, you never will. That's not what I mean by that. What I mean by that is, in my experience, it takes people a long time, even after awakening, to really know what I mean by direct experience, to really experience directly. Can take people quite a while. And to realize the value of it, which is kind of tied in. So